From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Morning Line with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Morning Line. I am Nick Barris. It is Thursday. And how are you doing? You're doing well enough that you're someplace where you have shelter, you have a roof over your head, and you have a TV, and you're watching us, and I appreciate you being with us this morning. The thing is, I don't know how you made it through some of the pandemic with regard to paying rent, with regard to paying a mortgage, things like that. Certainly, there were a lot of people that lost work. Things are still trying to get back up and running, and of course, we're still very much in the pandemic. And for the past year, there was a moratorium on evictions. But as you know, last week, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected the White House bid to continue the moratorium on evictions, and thus they can kick back in. This is a point where folks now who cannot afford and have fallen behind on their rent for a variety of reasons can be evicted. In the past the year, you weren't able to do that if you were a landlord because of the unique circumstances. Certainly there's two sides to this coin. You sympathize with anyone in a situation like this who can't afford their rent, and the moratorium allowed them during a very difficult time to stay where they were living. But at the same time, there are landlords who have mortgages to pay and the like that we're not having the income come in. You have to find some type of balance. So the White House trying to find a way to set aside some money to help folks who have fallen behind on it. But the bottom line, the moratorium is going to be lifted and people will become homeless, or in other ways, maybe move in with others. We're going to talk about that, what kind of situation we see moving forward, as well as perhaps, solutions and help that's there with Marybeth Shinn. She's the Cornelius Vanderbilt Chair, Department of Human Organizational Development, and she knows homelessness, and I appreciate you joining us, Professor. I think you also know about this moratorium and what the lifting of the eviction moratorium means for what? I guess millions of families across the country, thousands here in Tennessee. How significant is this?
Well, thanks so much for having me. I think it is important. I mean, some evictions have been going on despite the moratorium over the last year, but I think we're going to see a lot more now. And there is some help on rental assistance from Washington, and Nashville has done better than some states and some cities in getting it out the door, but we haven't gotten all the help that's available out to the people who have applied for it yet, so we really need to accelerate that. When people get evicted, they have to go somewhere. And the first thing they do is they call up their relatives and their friends and they move in with them. And so people double up and they're in more overcrowded circumstances, and we're in the midst of an epidemic. And so that's likely to increase the spread of COVID. And Tennessee is a hotspot for COVID right now. Down the road, when those arrangements break down, or for the people who can't make those arrangements, some will take to the shelters of the streets.
I think that's an obvious conclusion that ultimately could happen, where there will some be out on the streets or hitting the shelters. With regard to how the evictions will happen, I know you're not an expert on evictions, but I mean, clearly we have people here who have fallen behind for months on end. Maybe some of them have now returned to work and maybe can make good on their monthly rent, but is the problem here for many of them that they've just fallen so far behind, there's no way for them to make up on the several months that they weren't able to pay?
That's often the case, and that's why we have some federal rent relief, and we need to get it out the door to the people who are eligible for it to help to pay for those arrears. It's not really in a landlord's interest to evict someone who is currently paying the rent. Right. Just have to find somebody else and probably give up on that back rent. So if people can get into paying current rent, they may be able to cut deals with landlords.
I'm wondering too, do you imagine, you say there is going to be money available for some of those folks who have fallen behind, which is great, federal dollars. And I think maybe people have an image of landlords, some of them just being high dollar people that own these very expensive properties, but their landlords come to all shapes and sizes and economic backgrounds. To your knowledge, is there some of that money also going to go toward them? And I'm saying I have sympathy for both sides of this, because a lot of these landlords, they don't own the property flat out. It may have been an investment property that a family family had bought and weren't able to evict someone, and it went for months without getting the rent. Thus, they couldn't pay the mortgage on the property they own, and I sympathize with them.
That's a really important point, because there are a lot of small mom and pop landlords who provide much of the affordable housing in Nashville and elsewhere. And so when they can't pay their mortgage, they're in trouble too. So the idea of rent relief is that that money goes to pay the rent that the landlords are owed. So the rent relief helps both the tenant and the landlord. The tenant doesn't put it in his or her pocket. It goes to the landlords. So that money then comes back into the community. The landlords can spend it. It helps the economy more broadly.
You know, just talking about homelessness here in the metro area, we want to avoid it, obviously. We have the Metro Action Commission, which is one of those organizations that's trying to get the monies out, at least here in Davidson County, to keep that from happening. In your view here, and maybe because you live here and you work here, as you see homelessness in Nashville right now with regard to the pandemic, where do we sit right now? Has it gotten significantly worse over the past year? I think you're predicting that we may see a little bit of an increase because of this lift on the moratorium. Your thoughts on the homelessness right now and where it's going?
Well, we're seeing more people out of doors. People have been scared to come into congregate shelters. Some of our shelters have become COVID hotspots. And so we're seeing more people who are in encampments, who are out of doors. The Homeless Impact Division is working really hard to get people housed. And we have some additional federal resources for that as well, to try to help people get into housing who've been on the streets. There we need landlords to step up and cooperate. So we have housing subsidies that we can use to help people get into housing after they've been homeless. And the Homeless Impact Division is searching for landlords that can step up and house people.
Yeah, and what would you say now? Maybe it's changed over the years. I've noticed it in the years, you know, Marybeth, when I've done stories over at the Mission and seen, you know, 20 years ago when I would go over there, there was a different demographic there than you see now. It is much more broad. Back then, it was mostly men that I saw there, and they were older. Today, among the whole homeless population, I see much younger, and sadly, it not only applies to women as well, and I think it did in the past too, but especially children. What does the demographic look like?
Well, nationally, about a third of folks who are experiencing homelessness at any given time are members of families. The age at which you are most likely to be found in a homeless shelter in the United States is infancy. That is, infants are at higher risk of being in a homeless shelter than anybody else.
Wow.
And, you know, when you think about it, infants are a blessing. Babies are wonderful, but they're also costly. They outgrow their clothes every time you turn around. And most importantly, they take somebody out of the labor force to take care of them, typically a parent, or if the parent might pay somebody else to take care of that child. Either way, that's very costly to the family. And so that puts families with infants at special risk.
Okay, I didn't realize that. So I guess that's the reason why. I didn't know the number one most likely group to be, as you're saying, homeless is an infant, a baby. For real.
Rates of homelessness stay high in the preschool years. They drop a little bit when you get to that subsidized childcare called public school. And they kind of stay a little lower during the school years. They pop up again in early adulthood when some of those folks are parents of those young children. You know, there are more single men that are homeless than there are families, but single men come in a lot of ages, and the single age at which you're most likely to be in a shelter is infancy. Okay,
and for so many families, I think we know they're one paycheck or one unexplained or unexpected expense from possibly being homeless. It can get that close. And it doesn't help if you live in this area when you look at the cost of rent. That's what's unreal. And because the cost of real estate has gone up so much, more people are renting. So maybe there are fewer people or places available for people to rent. And when they find a place, I mean, that's part of the problem here, isn't it, in Davidson County, is that there's no affordable housing or very little.
That's absolutely true. It's true across the country. There are 7.5 million Americans who are below, we call them very low income, that's roughly below poverty, who are paying more than half of their income on rent. And if you have very little to begin with and you're paying over half of it on rent, this was before COVID, this is before the emergency, the pandemic, and any kind of trigger event, if you lose a job, if you have an illness, if you have an unexpected expense, can put you behind.
And we're seeing that happen. Listen, we're going to take a break, Professor. When we come back, we're going to talk more about this and maybe more just looking in on the help that might be there for those who are actually already homeless now. And many of our viewers may know some folks who need that help, as well as what maybe someone's sitting there realizing, yeah, this moratorium's lifted. They're going to come after me to move me out. What are my options? We'll talk about that and take a few phone calls for you as well right after this. Stay with us.